All right, guys, Greg Melita here. I'm here with Brian DeLuca, Jiu-Jitsu Motivation Podcast. Today, we have two awesome guests, guys, that we really appreciate coming on today. We have Professor Robert Drysdale and Professor Pedro Valente, Valente Brothers. And we want to discuss Jiu-Jitsu history today. We know they did one already on a Portuguese version, so we'd love to get their opinions and takes. There's a lot of us in the Jiu-Jitsu world and the Jiu-Jitsu space going through our journey. And we really just want to get some more knowledge and understanding of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, Jiu-Jitsu history in general. We have Professor Robert's book here, and it's an amazing book, Open and Closed Guard. I actually pre-ordered it. I was so into wanting to check that out, and also been following Professor Valente's Valente Brothers YouTube channel for a while now, and they've been really doing a great job with their YouTube channel and history and techniques and preserving the roots. So welcome, guys. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So Robert, just so you know, I'm sitting next to this book. It's pretty worn out already.
Yeah.
So he's definitely been reading it.
Definitely been going through that book. And then on that note, here we go. There it is. Nice. So actually, on that note, Professor Robert, what's the update on the documentary film? How's that going?
Yeah, it's I always start by apologizing because I feel I've been promised this for so long. But like, I am in less in a hurry now than I was a year ago. I'll tell you why. I think that as the more this project grows and more people know about it, the more I realize its importance. So I want to do it right, So a lot of things have been. There's been a lot of things we cannot get access to because we can't get rights to, and that's a back and forth, and it's all expensive. All of this costs, so it's been a complicated project. I think part of it had to do with my inexperience. I walked into this knowing nothing about film, so I'm basically thinking, we have 140 years of history. We can tell it in 90 minutes, no problem.
Yeah,
and there's no way you can do that without jumping through huge segments and with what's important. What do you leave out? Like, which part of the story who do you cut out? Because you can't talk about everyone at length. So it's been very, and then you're trying to be fair to everyone. You're trying to be as unbiased as you can. You're trying to also do something that's watchable, not only to people who know the history, but also people who have never heard of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. When you make a film, you have to keep in mind that a big portion of people going to be watching this may either not know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is or have only one or two classes. They may never have heard of Helio Gracie, for example. I can't make a film and go, there's Helio Gracie, assuming that the audience knows who he is. I have to introduce him. Right? I got to do the same with Takeo Yano. I got to do the same with George Gracie, and I got to do the same with Carlos Gracie, and then I got to do the same with Maeda, and I got to do the same with Gio Mori. And that right there is 30 minutes of your film. So it's been making it possible, but I do have some news. I don't want to break it yet.
I
do have some. I think we will be. We have nonstop been made. We've never stopped with the film. That's the good. It is happening. It is just one of those things where we're prioritizing quality over speed.
All right. Well, that's good. I mean, that's good news. We know everybody is looking forward to that, and we know, it's a huge undertaking, getting funding, getting the filming. So, we'd rather see a complete film done right than try to rush it. So,
yeah. I mean, you guys obviously both know a lot about the history of Jiu-Jitsu. Do you think a lot of people see it as very black and white? Like, they don't see all the gray that is in history?
Yes, I think that's one of the biggest problems. And there are also political reasons why people want to defend one side or the other side. Some people bring an emotional component to the study of history, and it almost becomes like politics, two political parties or two soccer teams, where people kind of believe that they are part of a camp and they have to defeat the other side. And unfortunately, as I have delved into the history of Jiu-Jitsu and started to meet some of the researchers, and I noticed that this happened a lot, and that some people were bringing very strong biases into their research. And my approach, and I believe it's the same approach as Robert has, is to try to find out what really happened, without bringing our personal biases too much into the research. Obviously, there's always going to be some bias. I am a student of Hélio Gracie. He was like a grandfather to me. So it's important that people know that and they understand my personal relationship with him. So it's impossible for me to just erase that. However, I try to be as objective as I can, and I'm also open-minded. And I've been learning a lot of new things through this process, and I'm not committed to any mistakes that I might have made in the past. I can easily change my mind and I can easily learn new things and adapt. And I think that's the essence of jiu-jitsu anyway, flexibility and adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, well, I make his words my own. Me and Pedro have discussed this at length in private and elsewhere. It has been a huge problem for the profession. I mean, Pedro has dealt with the same issue at some point. People are unable to see the world in more than two colors, right? And I have an issue with it. I talk about the binary issue because it's an issue everywhere. People, it's too difficult to see a third color or a fourth color, fifth color. So it's easier just simplify it like the world where a Disney cartoon between good and evil. My side is always the good one, of course. You know, and I reject that entirely. I think it's poor history reading. And anyone who writes something like that is poor history writing. And I just to give you an example of like how difficult this has been. When I first started this project, I had people on all different camps, like excited. Anti-Gracie camp was like, yes, finally. And then I'm like dropping compliments to saying things like, I think the beginning of this story is not Maeda. The beginning of this story is Carlos Gracie. I'm centralizing like Carlos as the epicenter of jiu-jitsu.
Right.
And then guys that are fiercely anti-Brazilian. And they thought I was going to be like shitting all over Brazilians, going like, finally, we're going to show that Brazilians didn't do anything, Brazilians didn't create anything. And they're posting about it because they're assuming it's an anti. Like, I'm talking about the submission-only crowd, the American Jiu-Jitsu crowd. Anything that's not Brazilian, yes. And then they see that, in fact, I'm not attacking Brazil, they get disappointed and they stop supporting. And then they get the guys in judo in Brazil. Same thing. The guys in judo. But first, yes, finally, we've been saying this for all these years. It's judo, it's not jiu-jitsu. And then I say, well, they basically got something you guys neglected, which was the martial aspect of judo. They kept alive and they created the UFC, which is the second greatest revolution in the history of martial arts. And the Gracie family did that. And then the judo were so happy all of a sudden, right? So one of those things where you cannot make the extremists happy, but I take that as a good sign. I think if the extremists are unhappy with you, then I almost take it as, okay, I must be on the right track.
Right. No, definitely. That's definitely a good point. We have, between reading the book and then, my years training and doing some research. And we also have, we've seen both you guys on other podcasts, like Robert, you're on, I think you're on Shadi's podcast. We're actually going to have him as a guest on here too. But we've seen a lot of different questions on different YouTube channels that have talked about this. We've also gone through your book. We've watched a lot of the Valente Brothers videos. So we have a set of questions here that we can just hip fire at you guys. And then one at a time, you guys can tackle that or can converse amongst yourselves with that. First couple of ones here. And Robert, we caught that video that you did covering Fabio Gurgel's points as well. So we were using that as well, too. So I want to bring up the first one where did the Gracies specifically use the jiu-jitsu name to differentiate themselves from judo, where not necessarily were they learning pre-Meiji jiu-jitsu actual, you know what I mean? There was Kodokan judo like that and the focusing on the ground, but did they deliberately want to use the jiu-jitsu name to, differentiate themselves in what was big in the time in Brazil, which was judo?
I don't know how much of that was intentional or accidental. It was just like it just went with the flow. I know that when Maeda first came to Brazil, the term jiu-jitsu was still more popular than the term judo. So they just might have stuck the term they were more familiar with. And as new waves of Japanese came, they were bringing the term judo, and then judo became more associated with the modern version of Kodokan. And what they were practicing was something that they still referred to as jiu-jitsu because that's what everyone called it, when Maeda first came to Brazil. We know that they weren't pre-Meiji jiu-jitsu is a huge category. Swords, kicks, you name it, like spears. It's not what the jiu-jitsu we called it. Jiu-jitsu called it came from judo. Granted, it's important to remember that Kodokan judo has been changing ever since it was first developed. Like it's never stopped changing. like any other martial art. Like if you look at jiu-jitsu in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's always changing. The rules are changing in judo.
Mhm.
It is, what Maeda was teaching in Belém do Pará at the time. That's not clear. We don't know for sure. We know that he was a Kodokan student. We know that he had experience in sumo. We know that he had experience in catch wrestling, a very brief existent. Now, if that style was more stand-up oriented or ground oriented, we don't know. We know that Maeda does make a comment about not liking the ground. I suspect, and I'm not sure if Pedro agrees with me on this. Like maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. I suspect, and I can't back this up, that the reason why, Brazil, what we now call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu became so ground oriented has to do with two reasons. A, was tactical, like the Japanese were better than Brazilians at stand-up. Two, it has to do with infrastructure in Brazil. Anyone who's ever been in the gym in Brazil will see that the gyms are very, very small. It is very difficult to practice standing in a small space, right? So that ground game might have been a reflex of the lack of funds in Brazil, which is a problem that judo would not have. It might have had it in the beginning, but it would not have down the road once government funding begins, private sector and government begin to fund judo because it's an Olympic sport, which is a support that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu never had. They have very different sort of sponsors. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu only had private sponsors, very few individuals, whereas judo has had big money behind it, right? So that plays a role in how the sports, which direction it takes. But from my understanding, it's what is practiced in Brazil, what we now call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is primarily Kodokan Judo, traditional, old school Kodokan Judo, you can call it, with other elements, everything from capoeira to catch wrestling to anything that could have absorbed along the way, because it was a martial purpose. Like it was less sport oriented, it was more martial oriented. And in a martial culture, you would expect them to make, assimilations that are outside the scope of sport, which is what judo towards, more than jiu-jitsu did at that time.
Interesting.
If I can add to that, I feel that there was a necessity to specialize more on the ground. There's even a letter that Mitsuo Maeda sent to Japan where he talks about the fact that he had to improve his ground game, and he did that when he was in the West in order to be able to face the wrestlers. It was difficult to throw the wrestlers, and on the ground they felt like they had a better chance to face the wrestlers. The Gracie brothers as well, the beginning of their journey, they start facing some stronger fighters, boxers. Even in the late 20s in Sao Paulo, you already have accounts of George Gracie doing fights against boxers, against the wrestlers. And so I think they also felt that the ground was the way to go in order to win these challenges. Also because on the ground you can have a definitive end to the match, where a throw, unless you have the rules, it doesn't really create a clear winner the same way. With a throw, it doesn't create a clear winner the same way that a submission does, where the other fighter has to tap out. And so I think that was the main reason why they became specialists on the ground. Now, I also believe that moving forward as Japanese practitioners, because in Japan, there's no doubt that Jigoro Kano was directing the practice more towards throwing techniques. And I believe one thing that is very, very difficult to speak about right now is how jiu-jitsu was practiced before the Kodokan. We know that there was randori. We know that there was sparring. We know that they were sparring standing up and on the ground. Now, we don't have much information about that, but we have Jigoro Kano's accounts where he talks about sparring with his teachers, and we have other accounts. We have some of the Japanese who introduced jiu-jitsu in the West who were not from the Kodokan. In their accounts, there's a book written by Sada Uenishi, and he says in the book that when he talks about jiu-jitsu and judo, he says, and the judo style, as jiu-jitsu proper is often styled in Japan, but which does not imply so much groundwork as was practiced in earlier times. So he's saying that in earlier times, whatever that means, this book was written around 1906, 1908. He says in earlier times, before the Kodokan, there was more groundwork. As Robert said accurately, pre-Kodokan Jiu-Jitsu, Koryu Jiu-Jitsu, the old schools of Jiu-Jitsu, that term is very broad. Different schools were practicing in completely different ways. Some focused more on striking, others more on arresting techniques, others more on throwing techniques, and I'm sure some on ground techniques. And we know that they were sparring. And so what exactly was the influence of the Kodokan? How much the Kodokan transformed Jiu-Jitsu, right? Remember, when the Kodokan was formed, Jigoro Kano was a kid. He was 22 years old. Mm-hmm. Right? And so a few years later, the Kodokan was already doing challenge matches against other jiu-jitsu schools, and they were sparring each other. And Jigoro Kano brought people like Shiro Saigo and Yokoyama. These guys, they were jiu-jitsu practitioners from other schools, and he brought them into his team to be able to defeat some of the other teams. So we don't know how much groundwork was done before. We know that people like Uyenishi, Yuki Otani, Taro Miyake, those guys who were not from the Kodokan were very good on the ground. Maeda became very good on the ground. So there was a big movement of ground fighting around that time that we know when Jiu-Jitsu came to the West in the beginning of the 20th century. And we also know that these guys were using the term Jiu-Jitsu, as Robert said. So I believe that's the reason why the Gracies use Jiu-Jitsu, because just that's the term that they learned. And also, Jiu-Jitsu on the ground was very popular at the time, and I think that's why they also became specialists in that. Now, later on, when the other waves of Japanese fighters started to come to Brazil and they were specialists on the throws, I think it was convenient for them to focus on the ground and to try to make sure that the rules of judo for points for throws were not used, so that they could fight the Japanese using their greatest expertise, which was ground grappling.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I think that definitely does. We have a couple different ones here. Let's see. Next one. So we learned from all different sources, neither side has proof for or against the fact that Maeda actually trained Carlos. I mean, if you think of a new person coming in and we have different pictures on the wall of, Kano, Maeda, and Carlos, and Helio, and so on. And even me coming up through the ranks training, that's the narrative that I was told, was that, hey, Maeda taught the Gracies. But now, whether it's through the lineage or actually Maeda being the one that physically taught him, I think is the question. But Robert, do you think it's neither side has proof of that for or against, right?
Well, yes. I mean, it's hard to prove a negative, right? Like, and neither is that how we pursue things. But I don't. First of all, I like to emphasize, I do bring this topic up in the book. It's in the documentary. It might be mentioned briefly, but I don't think it's central. I don't think it's that important. The reason why this seems to be such an important topic is because every gym, the history of jiu-jitsu has been traditionally encapsulated into pictures on the wall. It's been 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the extent of people's knowledge about jiu-jitsu history. I'm serious. I'm not even if you ask 99% of practitioners, ask them what they know about jiu-jitsu history, they're going to go, Maeda taught Carlos, who taught Helio, who taught the next person in line, whoever that is, right? And I think because of that because we know up to very recently, we knew so little about jiu-jitsu history, everything's been centralized about that story. That's why it seems to really shock people. Mm-hmm. I like to emphasize that, in my opinion, that's not that important. It's relevant. I think it has to be recorded as accurately as we can. To me, Jacinto Ferro does belong in that story, possibly Gio Mori as well. But I don't think that is nearly as important as other elements in the story, which for some reason are less interesting to most people. But there's the evidence that we have points to Jacinto Ferro. Now, I have to make a distinction between Robert, that is going to make a safe gamble, and I'm going to have to make a distinction between Robert, the historian, right, or the pseudo historian. I'm not a pro at this, but I do like my history readings. It's always been like a side job for me. The Robert, if I had to gamble, if you put a gun to my head and say, Rob, you have to pick like red or I'm in Vegas, right? So red or black, roulette.
Right.
Did
Put your money down.
Carlos meet Maeda or not? I would gamble that he did. Now, how much experience he had with Maeda, to me, that's a big question. Like, I think Carlos exaggerated the nature of that relationship and I'm thankful that he did it, for the record, because had he not done it, he would have had a really hard time pushing himself the way he did. It was necessary because he had zero credibility at the time. Remember, he's a Brazilian talking about teaching jiu-jitsu in Sao Paulo in 1929. Are you kidding me? Who's going to believe him? No one's going to take him seriously. So, like, if you claim Maeda, you gain a lot of credibility by that. But then you have Robert, the historian. We got to go, well, it's you have to be careful. I make this analogy in the video with Fabio, where I go, because Fabio like doesn't understand this, and I'm going, if you're going to build a house, you can't build a house with a brick that may or may not hold 10 years from now. If you're going to put a brick there in the foundation of the house, it's got to be a very solid brick. You can't go, this right here, there's a 90% chance it's going to work. You can't do that. Like, that's not how science works. It's not how history works. You have to have something that's solid, because you're building a foundation of other evidence on top of that piece of evidence, right? But we can't go by speculation. Speculation is, however reasonable it may be, even if we could say, if we could quantify it, and the 99.9% chance that he did, we still can't. We got to be careful with it, is what I'm saying, because that right there may blow up in our face 10 years down the road with something completely misconstrued, 10 years of historiography based off of something that turned out to be false. So to me, it's clear that Carlos did exaggerate the relationship with Maeda. To me, that's at the very least, he left Jacinto Ferro out of the story, at the very least. With that being said, the extent of his relationship with Maeda, to me, is a great question. Although I think it's because it's very likely that he at least met him at some point. Like, Donato Pires dos Reis, who turned out to be an enemy of the Gracie family down the road, he categorically says that Carlos never met Maeda. I am skeptic of Donato Pires dos Reis' testimony for the same reason I'm skeptic of Carlos's original testimony that he was a student of Maeda. These guys, they said what they wanted the press to hear. Like, that was not unusual with them. It's normal today. People are highly political and biased today. I mean, then you can get away with it because it was harder to fact check people. I mean, how are you going to fact check what Carlos is saying, or Donato Pires dos Reis is saying? You know, like in Sao Paulo and Rio, when Maeda's in Belém do Pará, you couldn't just call people. Then it wasn't so simple. You can write a letter and ask, right? The communication wasn't the same as we have to. So it's hard to fact check people. So you can get away with a lot. And I remain skeptic, but I think whatever relationship they had, it's clear to me that it was not as neither is that important, to be honest, and it was as extent as some people would believe.
So isn't that how history sort of works, though? As time goes on, new information comes out or new facts come out, and we evolve our opinion of it, or what may be, deemed as true or not true in any case, anything in history.
Yes, I would say so. And this is why we call it theories, right? Because what was built, it's not an absolute truth. It's not how it works. And it should be that way. And if someone, by the way, came along and corrected me tomorrow and went, by the way, Robert, here is factual proof that, I'll be thankful. I don't have, I don't have a dog in this fight, guys. I'm just trying to write as I understand historiography. Like, I would not be upset, and I wouldn't be wrong either. I wouldn't be wrong if someone came up with a letter tomorrow and proved them. Like, I wouldn't be wrong, because I'm writing based off of the published evidence. For example, Elton Silva claims to have like a letter from Takeo Yano talking about the Gracie family, Carlos Gracie and Belém do Pará. I've never seen it. It's not published. I don't have to go by people's words. I don't have to go by speculation. I don't have to go by things that may or may not be. I have to write based off of what's published and known. And if it's not published and it's not known, then it's in the gray area. And it's not until it's proven otherwise, right? The nature of things is not being. That's, so you can't go like everything is, and then we'll go excluding things that are. It's not how science works. But I'd be perfectly willing to update the book if something came about tomorrow. And I have zero issues doing this. I'll be thankful for the person who presented something that added to the story.
Yes, there is a newspaper article from the early 1920s that points to both Donato Pires dos Reis and Carlos Gracie as being students of Jacinto Ferro. Jacinto Ferro was Maeda's #1 student and was teaching actually under Maeda, in Maeda's school. In fact, the newspaper doesn't say Carlos Gracie, it says Oscar Gracie. But based on the fact that we could not find any person of that name, Oscar Gracie, living in Belém do Pará at the time, we assume, theory is that probably that was a mistake. And that most likely they were referring to Carlos, because Carlos, Oscar is almost like in reverse, and that they made a mistake and that they were referring to Carlos Gracie. So most likely Carlos was in some way a student of Jacinto Ferro. I believe that that makes him automatically a student of Mitsuyo Maeda because Jacinto Ferro was teaching under Mitsuyo Maeda. I agree with Robert. I also believe that at some point that Carlos trained with Maeda. Now, we know that they met because in this event where Carlos actually does a match against Donato Pires dos Reis, we know that Maeda was present at that event. So that newspaper article puts Carlos and Maeda together in the same place at the same time.
Right.
So we know that most likely, if Oscar Gracie is Carlos Gracie, most likely it is, then we know that they at least met each other. But I would, and that's once again my opinion, I would say that Carlos, in fact, probably took classes from Maeda, and we have different accounts talking about that. We have João Alberto Barreto's father-in-law, who actually lived in Belém do Pará, also trained Jiu-Jitsu at the time, who said that Carlos did train with Maeda. Donato Pires dos Reis, a few years after the first comment that he makes where he says that Carlos never met Maeda, he actually, when he opens a school together with George Gracie in São Paulo, he gives an interview saying that the Gracies were students of Maeda. So as Robert said, we don't have any hard evidence on this subject, but it is to me, it is likely that Carlos did train under Maeda. Now, should he have mentioned Jacinto Ferro as his teacher? Maybe. But I would also point out that back then, we don't have many interviews where people are asking questions about history. How exactly did you learn Jiu-Jitsu? It was more a promotion. Carlos Gracie promoting himself, using Maeda's name, which was a popular name at the time. And I don't see really a place for him to really talk about Jacinto Ferro. Today you have all these interviews where people explain their lineage, their roots. Back then you didn't have that as much. And so I believe that it's important for us researchers and for the historians to bring back these names and to give them the credit that they deserve.
Yeah, and to that point, it just seems that whether or not Carlos actually physically was on the mat with Maeda was showing him these moves. It still seems to be relevant that it's the lineage. It's obviously, so whether he trained with Maeda or not, it was still the lineage of Maeda. Now was that sold differently to all of us, maybe, but it's clear that the lineage is there. How much physically was Maeda, on the mat with Carlos is a different story. It's up for interpretation, I guess. But
I'm hopeful that more evidence is going to come about. I think that all these debates, more people becoming interested in the history. I think Robert contributed to this tremendously with his documentary and his book. I think that this brings a lot of attention to the subject, and with attention, you have more people who are going to research and dedicate time. And I think more information is going to come, and in the future, we'll be able to tell this story more precisely.
Can I add one thing there? And it's just really, I think that what needs to be rethought here is entirely our ideas of how we learn. Like I mentioned this briefly in the book. I've made this case in interviews. We all have a teacher. We all have teachers, right? But how we learn is not like we have that old idea. You have an empty glass of water, and then you have knowledge from someone else and pour it into your brain. Like I think that the whole idea of lineages is so arbitrary. I think we do have role models. We do have instructors. I've been a teacher for many years, and I feel that my job is more than teaching jiu-jitsu. is maintaining a good culture in the gym for people to learn jiu-jitsu, because your best teacher are really the mats. It's experience,
Definitely.
getting beat up. That's where most of the knowledge is coming from, losing.
Mhm.
Like, losing is how. This is why I'm very skeptical. People are like, oh, I know a lot of jiu-jitsu, they never lost. I'm like, that's strange to me. You know, that teaches you, right? So I think not that you should be discrediting your instructors, but I think the role of the coach is not so much pouring knowledge into someone's empty brain, but like creating the space for the experiences take place of learning, right? So this overemphasis on lineage to me is incorrect. I don't think it has much to do with how we learn. Um, I don't think, again, like, I just want to say one more time, I don't think I think it should be recorded as accurate as we can, but and there's so many more interesting aspects to the story where people just completely fly through. They don't even want to talk about. They want to talk about that. Guys, there's some really cool stuff here. Like, and it's just, um, I said this before. I've said this in the book, and I think that the resistance to judo to me is like astounding. To me, it's like, it's shocking. The more I think about it, I'm like, it's amazing, like incredible, like how and why, like what is the why behind all of that? Because it's absolute silence in Brazil compared to what's going on in judo. It made no tactical sense to remain outside of the judo sphere. Um, there was no one paying attention to what they were doing. It was just them and their friends, and like small. It was niche. It was very small. They're not to have that many practitioners, and despite what people think, I think that right there is by far the most important aspect of this story, and the biggest contribution of Carlos and Helio and others. You know, I always like to mention that, even though they're central, there are many other people involved in this. But that right there to me is by far their biggest contribution. Whether Maeda taught Carlos or not to me is important, but it doesn't change the end result, and it doesn't make it that more or less interesting to the person.
And if I can add to that, another problem with the lineage debate is how difficult it is, because usually it takes a lifetime to learn. And you have many different teachers. For example, we don't know exactly what Maeda's relationship with Jigoro Kano was. Did Maeda actually learn directly from Jigoro Kano? Did Jigoro Kano actually teach Maeda? Because a lot of people, they also use that lineage. Maeda, Kano. But who was Maeda's teacher? That's another difficult conversation.
There's in Craze, and there's a chapter in there that talks about that. Pedretta points out the 4 Japanese instructors that would have been Maeda's. None of them is Tokuguro Ito. I can't remember their name, but there are 4 of them that would have been Maeda's teacher. Neither is it Kano or is it Tokuguro Ito. If by the way, if you guys haven't read Craze, I know Pedro has. I highly recommend it. I think they're better than Shockey, if you're asking. Very good books. Craze 3 and 4 are coming out soon. They're coming out simultaneously. But it's interesting. Like, you're right. Like, we put Maeda as a student of Jigoro Kano, but what we know is pointed right. And that's another. You know, if we're going to really get to if the lineage thing is going to be central, we have to rethink everything, because what we know is there's no connection that we know of between Kano and Maeda.
Right. We spend so much time talking about lineage, right? Like our lineage, and to Pedro's point, we're taught by multiple people, over the course of our lifetimes or our journey in jiu-jitsu. Isn't it more of what we fall in love with, the culture of jiu-jitsu? Like, it's that whole culture piece that we all come and we love, and that's what sort of we just love about the whole sport in general.
Pedro, you want to go?
Yes. I think you're absolutely right. I believe that the understanding the history of the culture of jiu-jitsu is also very interesting, because the culture of BJJ, as we understand it today, is a product of the 1960s. And also to understand what was happening in the world in the 1960s, and the cultural void that was created by the break with judo. Because a lot of people don't know this, but in the 1930s, in the 1940s, until the 1950s, there was no clear distinction between jiu-jitsu and judo in Brazil. It was considered to be the same thing. The Gracies were always resisting some of the modern expressions of the art and how they were being presented by some of the Japanese who were coming to Brazil at that time. But basically, they all felt that they were doing the same thing. They felt that they were part of the same community. The break only happens later. And so the culture of jiu-jitsu was always the culture of Japan. They wore the kimonos, they used, the name was Japanese, right? The mats were Japanese. It was a Japanese culture. But when the Gracies break, you can see clearly that they also reject the culture of bowing, the culture of respect, because they no longer want to be associated with judo and with the Kodokan, and they want to have something that is independent from that.
Yeah, definitely.
So then there is a lot of the jiu-jitsu practitioners, a lot of Gracie family members are involved with surfing at the time. And a lot of that aspect of culture comes onto the mats. And then you start seeing a lot of the surfing culture becoming jiu-jitsu culture, because there was no other culture, because the Japanese culture was kind of rejected. Another point is that in the beginning, they were mostly teaching private classes. And if you come to take a private class from me, there's no much need for formality. We shake hands, we train, you leave. In a group class, some of these formalities become more necessary. And when the group classes start becoming more prevalent in the 60s and the 70s, then they have to create a new culture for the group classes. And that is influenced by surfing. It's influenced by the rock and roll culture of the 70s, the hippie culture of the 70s. And that is something that we see on the mat until today. But that is not the culture of the original Gracie brothers. It has nothing to do with the culture. It's quite different than the culture of Carlos and Helio Gracie and what they did until the 1950s.
Yeah, you mentioned the 70s. So now you brought up the 70s. We have a question, and I've seen this question pop up a lot. And I think it was in the book too, Robert. I'm not sure, but I think it might have been in a couple of the YouTube comments of the podcast that you were on. But the triangle, right? The move, the triangle. Is it true that the triangle wasn't really used or developed or discovered in Brazil until the 70s?
Yeah, I can give you a personal account, not personal, but firsthand from my father, who started training jiu-jitsu in 1952 and was dedicated to jiu-jitsu his whole life. He said that while he was training, and my dad, he actually fought in one of Carlson Gracie's preliminary. When Carlson fought Vale Tudo against Leão de Portugal, my father was in the undercard of that event. So my father was pretty high level, and he said he never learned the triangle at that time. The triangle came to jiu-jitsu. It was already being used in Japan for many years. And we actually saw, there's a picture of Ono, Yasuichi Ono, doing a triangle in a Brazilian newspaper in where he was preparing for one of the fights against Helio Gracie. But the triangle was not being taught the way we understand the triangle today. Some variations were being taught at the Gracie Academy, mostly holding the collar. But the triangle, as we understand today, was not taught by the Gracies until the 1970s.
Wow.
And it was a direct influence of judo. That's where they learned the triangle from. We don't know exactly. I don't know if Robert has more specific information on that. I know he interviewed a lot of people, but it was someone reading a judo book and introducing it, and then people finding out about it and training and developing it. But it was not part of the Gracie syllabus in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting there. Yeah, that came up a lot, and whether it's on Instagram or YouTube, and when that came out, like, wow, really, nobody knew a triangle, until the 70s. Like, I think people just automatically think, triangle was done for thousands of years in martial arts in general, Japan or anything like that. Robert, you came across anything with that?
I'll give you a better one. When I first started training jiu-jitsu, this is like 98, right? I was shown by my instructor, my first instructor, David Almeida Jr. He has a tape. I actually asked him for this tape. People I don't want to look for it, but he has a VHS tape somewhere. I hope he still does. Of Marcelo Bering teaching a seminar in Sao Paulo.
Mm-hmm.
91, 92, 93. To me, it looks like early 90s, right? And he's talking about, all right, guys, we can do this move we've been working on in Rio de Janeiro. It's called the triangle. So this is like early 90s. right? And a lot of people in some polls know what a triangle is. This is this is what we're talking. So the point I made, and this is why I bring up the triangle. I just like to emphasize that there are segments of judo in Japan that never abandoned the ground, like Olympic judo, right? They move towards, perhaps due to Jigoro Kano's own prejudice against the ground, which is very obvious. He makes it clear he's not. Perhaps because he wasn't a specialist at it, which is normal. People tend to specialize or talk about and teach what they like. Perhaps influenced by the ideas of being a gentleman, but we know he didn't like it. The other factor might be, beautiful throws sell more tickets than, me passing your half guard, right? So this is like what we're talking about. They have a concern here. It's the Olympics. You got to remember, Olympics is a private institution aimed at profits, just like my business, just like your business. They try to make money. Olympics doing the same thing. So selling tickets is important. They might have been influenced by that, which is why they're leaning more towards the throw and athlete, which is more impressive as well, as you would like, than a half guard pass, for example. And then with all of this, what's happening is judo is moving in a very, very different direction because of this. But in terms of I'm sorry, just remind me what the original question was. It's like a
triangle. Yeah, the triangle in the 70s. Yeah.
So, but there are segments of Japanese judo that kept practicing the ground as it was more emphasized before. It died in the Olympic judo, but like it's still alive in some schools in Japan, primarily Kosen judo, which is still judo. People think, oh, Kosen judo. No, Kosen judo is still judo. They just have a second rule set. So imagine IBJJF rule set and ADCC rule set. They're similar, but they're not identical, for example. But they're both pretty much jiu-jitsu. You're able to, compete in both rule sets if you're a judoka, for example. But these guys, these Kosen judokas, in the 1930s, 40s, they have a very sophisticated ground game. And the reason why I brought that up is I was trying. I don't know if everyone who read the book got it, but I was trying to contrast like. Brazil was behind Japan for most of its history in technical terms. When I'm talking, and this is another confusion maker, I'm not talking about Hicks and Gracie versus a judoka in the 1980s. That's not what I'm talking about here. I am talking about there was a technical canon that is not product of genius. I make this guy. I don't believe it's part of the genius. It's a product of competition. Competition creates an arms race, right? So there's X guard. You're gonna find X guard. You're gonna find X pass. You're gonna find De La Hiva. You're gonna find if you go on YouTube right now and you put in judo berimbolo, the guy is doing the same berimbolo pass that Buchecha does to Rodolfo in 2018, whatever it was. Like it's recent, and he's doing the thing that looks to me like the 1940s, 50s, maybe. But what that suggests, the reason I put that is like judo has had over the 20th century a very very highly developed technical canon on the ground. But because the rule set, it didn't make sense for any high-level judoka to specialize in something. For the same reason, it made no reason for me to specialize in heel hooks 10 years ago. It wasn't legal anywhere outside of ADCC. Like, why would I specialize in something that is barely allowed anywhere? The heel hook was always there, but to me, learning the heel hook was a waste of energy. Like, why? So, right? As the rules change, now you can incorporate this, right? But judo, that didn't happen. So the Kosen judo techniques, highly sophisticated groundwork, did exist. It just wasn't emphasized because it wasn't a big thing in Japan.
Right. So is it really a question? I mean, there are things that are created, but is it a question of sometimes just things being rediscovered? So we're rediscovering techniques that have been around for however long, and we're just like, oh, like to your point, now it fits into a certain rule set or whatever the case is. It's the rediscovery that becomes, important in some during the history.
So the wheel wasn't invented only in the Fertile Crescent. It was also discovered by the Aztecs. It was known by the Chinese. So the same people can have the same development / invention / discovery in completely different time, space and time. I think that when it comes to human anatomy, it's the same everywhere. If we're both on the ground trying to tap each other, it is just a matter of time before we figure out a De La Hiva. It is just a matter of time before we figure out a Kimura and a rear naked choke. It's not, but to the point, and I'm not trying to take credit. I just like to give credit. They did it first. I think, Columbus wasn't the first one in the Americas, but got a lot of the credit because there was a lot of developments, however you want to frame it, after Columbus. But the Vikings were here first, for example. right? And I think that's something similar. I think it's important to remember how sophisticated judo's ground game was throughout the 20th century. It was just not emphasized for obvious reasons.
No, and let me say something which is also important to illustrate this historically. If you look at all the interviews that were given by the Gracie brothers in the 30s, in the 40s, and the 50s, even in the 60s, they were not claiming that their technique was superior to the Japanese. What they were claiming is that the Japanese were hiding some of the technique, especially when it came to the ground.
Wow.
There are several interviews by both Carlos and Helio Gracie where they claim that the Japanese were not showing the sophistication of what they knew on the ground, that they were focusing mostly on the pins, right? You throw and then you get that honkezagatame pin on the side and you hold it for 30 seconds. A very, very basic, which is what was being taught by judo teachers in Brazil at that time. And in a way, I think they're vindicated, because if you look at what the Kozen judo guys were doing at that time, it was highly sophisticated. It was happening. But in Brazil, there was absolutely no access to that. And no one knew that there was a different rule set where they were practicing it in a very similar way that the Gracies were proposing. Because when the Gracies would actually say that Jiu-Jitsu could also be practiced on the ground with rules that would allow for the match to continue on the ground, many people, the authorities of judo, including the Japanese, would say that they were completely out of touch with what was happening in Japan, that this is not the way that it was practiced in Japan, and that they had to conform to the rules, the post-1925 rules, which greatly limited ground grappling. So they were not claiming at that time that they knew more than the Japanese, or that their style was more sophisticated than the Japanese. What they were claiming was that the jiu-jitsu that they were practicing was in line with what the Japanese were really practicing in Japan. I don't think that the Japanese were purposely trying to hide anything, but I feel that they were specializing on the throws because of the rules that were mostly practiced. If a lot of people don't know, Kozen just means higher education, high school. They were like colleges or the 7 imperial universities, and the competition between these schools was done with this different set of rules. So it was only for the students at the college level, and they were the only ones training and practicing under these rules. So it was a very specific thing that started after the real division in judo started after the 1925 rules that limited ground fighting, and these universities did not agree with these rules, and they wanted to continue using these rules that would allow for the match to continue on the ground. They liked Newaza, and then you have they liked ground grappling, and then you have the big names like Tsunetani Oda, you have Kanemitsu, you have guys, and that's where the triangle choke, for example, was not used at Maeda's time, from what we know. The triangle choke, as we know it today, was developed by the Kozen judo practitioners. And the video that Robert mentioned, that he saw the berimbolo, the X guard, the De La Riva guard, and all these sophisticated positions, they were filmed by the Kozen, some of the most important Kozen judo competitors, which includes Kimura, by the way. And when they were older, they filmed all these techniques so they would not be lost, because they recognized that this was not practiced anymore, and that in Japan, ground fighting was about to die. So they registered all these moves. They got together, all these old timers got together, and they recorded these videos, which are amazing, where you can see the sophistication of their craft. If it wasn't for these videos, we wouldn't even know it.
Yeah, that's huge. That's amazing. So we have some other questions here that tie into the jiu-jitsu history and how that intertwines with the modern day, and what you're seeing in jiu-jitsu today, and how that correlates. We see a lot of different correlations between what happened, how the Gracies developed the the ground game sophistication and how what we're seeing today in the current sport and state of grappling competition and where that's going. Before we get into the last segment of questions, we just want to jump in and do specifically what we do on the JJM podcast is we have somebody be able to send in a video of them rolling. It's called Review My Roll. And we also have the ability for them to send us a video on our website, and we send one back with a qualified black belt reviewing their roll. So we have a guest today here. He's a blue belt here at Hampton's Jiu-Jitsu. We have a little clip of him rolling, and we're just going to bring it up. And if you guys can, while you see the video, just shout out different things. Now, remember, this is just a sportive Jiu-Jitsu, once again, sport BJJ aspect of rolling. But we'll fast forward through this video. We have Chet on the line now. And
So Chet is
hi, guys. Big honor for me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so Chet's gonna be on the bottom right here. We're just doing a roll. So there's no strikes, Professor Valente. I know there's no strikes in this one. We're just doing regular sport jiu-jitsu, but it's some little roll here with a few of the guys here at Hampton's Jiu-Jitsu. Nice little butterfly guard sweep. Let's see. Trying to smash a la Robert Drysdale here. Let's see.
This storm bar. Oh, he's going for a choke.
Got to turtle up. Got the north south. Yeah. Got to fall out a little bit more.
Yeah, I really like pushing the rib cage into the head there to create pressure. Like a sandwich effect between the rib cage and the head. Hips very low.
Yeah, it does seem like his hips are very high. He didn't sprawl out enough on that.
You get caught in the half guard there.
Not completely, right? The foot's still out.
Yeah. Yeah, you put the knee in. Don't want to get caught in the lockdown.
Yeah,
Maybe
the
orange.
lockdown was used a lot by the Japanese. When you look at the Kozen videos, the lockdown was used a lot back then.
Even like the lockdown you see like Eddie Bravo style? Like that kind of way?
Same hook.
Wow.
I actually like lockdown with that sweep underneath.
Yeah.
Where you get the lockdown and then you bring your other arm on the other side underneath and sweep them.
See, the way you're positioning yourself there from side control is the classic way that the Gracies always taught, with that elbow on the ground on the other side and the hand blocking the hip, walking towards north-south. That's the classic Gracie way to control. I'm talking about the positioning of the arms.
Mm-hmm.
I saw you use it before, and you're using it again now. When you set up that north-south choke, you were using it. Attacking the leg.
Or you might lose that. You might come on top. Now, if it's point system, you might get 2 scored on you, but let's see. And Robert, you prefer the IBJJF rules or the ABCC style rules? Oh,
You're on mute, Robert. You're on mute.
I like the IBJJF rules, but I'd probably make some minor changes that would improve on them. I think some things while these excuses are better. I like the reverse of the
Yeah.
But the whole thing, total position of getting joints and things like that, makes it a mess. Like that's really, makes it very, very messy. But yeah, I mean, there's no perfect rules. The better rules. For the purpose of Chet here, Chet, like you get to really good positions, but I feel like you're either impatient or you're not seeing what's giving you. But he's giving you a lot, and I think with consistent pressure, you could probably get more. Like right there, like you have a head and arm, you have an Ezekiel, you have an arm bar, you have a back take. But like you said, you're on your knees. You should be digging your toes the whole time, leaning on that arm, and that's gonna. Here's the thing: by making that, now you got it. By making someone uncomfortable, you're going to get them to make a lot more mistakes. So, like the whole time you're on top, you're not looking for submissions. You're looking to make them miserable. And if you make them miserable, they're going to give you all sorts of free stuff, right?
And do I have to worry about my hips at all? Just driving that pressure down?
Your knees. Like one of my rule of thumbs when I'm teaching is if you're on top, your knees can touch the ground. They should never sit on the ground.
Okay.
The whole time. So you're shifting your weight to your upper body the entire time you're on top.
And just like grind into them?
The whole time. Because that right there has a long effect on your opponent. The other thing I'd watch out for is like right in the beginning there, when he went on top of you, you let him grab your head. Big no. Never let him grab the head. That's that's the anchor. That's the beginning of the end, right? You got to guard the head as much as you got to shrimp. They're equally important.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate that. And that's officially the first Review My Role on Jiu-Jitsu Motivation. Thanks for submitting that video, Chet.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a huge honor for me. Appreciate it, guys.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks,
Chet.
buddy.
Bye-bye.
Take care. So speaking, we have a few last questions here that I took. What do you guys think of? I always found it interesting, the void that, we say that there was a void created from judo where the Gracies specialized in the ground. You guys see any correlation of that with nowadays where you see somewhat of a void created in the leg lock game where that wasn't in the rule set, right? And then now you see these guys specializing in that where the ADCC rules, the submission only, and that created a void in itself for now this not only a new rule set, but even a whole new style, if you will, in the grappling, space. What do you think, Robert?
Yes, I think absolutely. There are a lot of similarities. I'm happy that IBJJF is legalizing heel hooks. I think they should be incorporated. I think the fear of injury is something that, from my experience, most injuries come from takedowns and transitions. It's the scramble where people get hurt. It's not the submission. I can't remember the last time a submission hurt me. It's normally me passing guard, defending a takedown. It's the sprawl. It's the scramble, right? Like the guy like going to take me down. He's missteps. I land on my shoulder or something like that. But I'm happy they're doing it. But there's definitely something. I wouldn't say that the whole thing that these guys go, oh, you're ignoring half the body. That's not true. You see, Hobson Gracie is talking about doing footlocks back in the day.
Right.
Footlocks have always been a part of the game. There has been, because they've never been legal other than ADCC, and that's only every other year, and that's only recently anyway, people never been bothered specializing in heel hooks. Like no one has ever specialized in heel hooks. And then you get Dean Lister, and then later you get other people influenced by him and whatnot. And the Luta Libre guys have always done the heel hook thing, but it's never been as sophisticated as it is today. Which, I think that there's something there to be added. I think it has its value. I think there's a very strong argument against heel hooks as well. I don't deny the strength of that argument. You got to remember when these rules were created, if you blew your knee from a heel hook, you'd be a cripple for life. The technology to reconstruct the knee did not exist 50 years ago like it exists today. So you have to take all these things in consideration, right? But I'm in favor of anything that makes the martial art better should be assimilated. Granted, we do have to be careful. I think IBJJF really is approaching it the right way. Why a brown and black adult, no gi only, like baby steps, right? See how it goes. I hope that they're keeping track of the injuries. So statistically, they're not ranking higher than other. I don't think they will, but if they are ranking much higher than other submission injuries, we might want to reconsider it. But my suspicion is that it won't be. I just hope they're keeping track of this so someone doesn't come along and uses one or two examples of someone getting their knee blown from a hook and going, ha, this is the whole story now, where statistically it ranks far below the Kimura, for example, right? Like if you're going to monitor it, you got to monitor everything.
Right. So you got to collect the data to even know.
It's something shocking that it's not done in jiu-jitsu. To me, like I'm actually talking to a guy from university in Brazil. Like we're talking about doing something together about just statistics. Just like putting something together, collect like thousands and thousands of matches and coming up with statistics on it, just because there's close to nothing out there. Right? As a coach, I'm really interested.
Right.
I want what's actually happening versus what we think is happening. I'll give you an example. When the Berimbolo thing revolution started 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whenever, that's all my students wanted to learn. They didn't want to learn anything else. And then BJJ Heroes came up with statistics. And turned out that Berimbolos were like 4% of the sweeps in the black belt division. And the vast majority were closed guard and half guard, right? And I think 50-50 was in there because 50-50 is a seesaw, so it doesn't really count. But It was like one of those things where you guys think that this is the whole story, and it turns out to be 4% of the story, and you're ignoring all this other stuff that's actually happening
Right.
because you consider it to be old school, for example.
Right.
So I think statistics is the only realistic way of looking at the sport.
And what's interesting too is you could not just collect it at tournaments, right? You could actually collect it at the academy level, to even know, okay, how do we train, and get some other data there that says, okay, this is a better way to train because if we're teaching this way or we're doing it this way, statistically, the students are less likely to get hurt or.
Yeah, Professor Valente, what do you think about that? I know at your academy, you guys do a lot of the self-defense aspect, incorporating strikes, and how do you see that with the current rule sets now, and even tying in? I think there's something to be said about this history now in this book, and you guys, and we're really looking into the history of jiu-jitsu. How we move forward from here. How everybody is going to get educated on the history, but you see a lot of differences and a lot of factions, if you will, of different people. Maybe they're focusing on no gi, maybe it's sport jiu-jitsu, and now a lot of people doing the self-defense aspect and preserving the roots of that. What's your opinion on that, and where do you see it going from here?
The way I see it is that jiu-jitsu is such a broad art that it allows for different expressions, different specializations, and we should all be proud of each other. As long as jiu-jitsu is practiced with a good philosophy, with a good mindset, in a positive way, I think it's good. And I think that even though we don't participate in the competition scene, we are very proud when we see a world championship with thousands of competitors from all ages and jiu-jitsu growing on that front. I think is something that makes us very happy. And I also believe that sport jiu-jitsu practitioners can be very proud of the effectiveness of jiu-jitsu in other ways, be it as a form of exercise, be it as an art of self-defense, its original purpose. And that's what we decided to specialize in. We feel that there are amazing schools doing a great job when it comes to sport jiu-jitsu. And because we were direct students of Grandmaster Helio Gracie, we wanted to make sure that we preserved a knowledge that was no longer emphasized. And that many people started to look at in a negative way, as if it's something ineffective, as if it's something that doesn't work. And we knew how effective it was. And also we understood that without regular practice, it would not be something that is done effectively at a high level. Just like grappling techniques. I always say that the triangle choke, for example, a white belt will perform a triangle choke in one way, a blue belt a little bit better, a black belt will have many different variations and setups for the triangle that a white belt won't know. Why is the knife defense any different? Why do people think that, oh, just show me the knife defense one and I know it and I can do it as a black belt? It requires constant practice just like anything else. And so we decided to specialize and to spend the time in this so that we could really develop it and continue to improve on it, because evolution is necessary.
Absolutely.
Right? We respect tradition, but we also believe in evolution. And we saw our teacher do that until the end. He was in his 90s and he would come to class and say, let me show you a new way that I figured out of doing this and that. So that was his mindset. He was very open-minded. Few people know that. Helio Gracie was cross-training from the beginning.
Yeah, you even saw a video of Helio doing a heel hook in the gi.
Yes, absolutely.
There's a video somewhere. I posted it on Jiu-Jitsu Motivation, and it's a video of Helio doing a heel hook in the gi, demonstrating it. And
the heel hook was always part of their curriculum since the 30s.
Wow.
Right? And there are newspaper articles that say that Helio Gracie's favorite technique was the footlock in the 30s. And so they were practicing leg locks, but also they were training with judo teachers. There was a Japanese judo teacher named Tada. Helio Gracie always told me that he was learning judo from him. You had capoeira guys coming to the school. Helio Gracie was an expert in throwing kicks, high kicks, low kicks. Catch wrestlers. They were in contact with fighters because when you're a fighter, you want to get better, you want to win. So you're gonna learn whatever it takes to be able to get better, and you're gonna be open-minded. And the Gracies were fighters. Now, with respect to rules and regulations, it's very important from a historical perspective to say that rules have a big impact on the evolution of the art. So the Gracies, they were promoting the rules of the book Game of Jiu-Jitsu, Taro Miyake's book and Yukio Tani's book from 1906. In that book, they say that a jiu-jitsu match starts standing up with throws, but then continues on the ground until there is a submission.
Wow.
So I don't know if the Gracies learned that from that book specifically, or if Maeda told them that, or how they learned it, but those are the rules that they were advocating for. And because of their prestige, they were able to get most of their fights to happen under those rules, even against the Japanese. Because of those rules, they developed the style that they developed. Helio Gracie was able to develop this amazing defense on the ground, where even from bottom side mount, even from bottom mount, he was able to survive and avoid submissions.
Mm-hmm.
Because one thing that people don't realize is how incredible it was and exceptional. This was not happening anywhere else in the world. For a Brazilian, a non-Japanese fighter, to face some of these amazing black belts from Japan and not lose and compete with them on the same footing. When Helio Gracie fights Yasuichi Ono was a great jiu-jitsu practitioner of the lineage of Kanemitsu, of Kozenjuro. He was a great grappler on the ground, and he fought Helio Gracie twice, and he couldn't submit him. That is amazing, given how new jiu-jitsu was in Brazil. Because I spoke to Robert about this before. I don't like. In history, it's very common for people to try to create messianic figures, right? Yeah. Helio Gracie invented leverage. I love Helio Gracie. He was my teacher. But Helio Gracie never claimed to have invented leverage, to have invented jiu-jitsu. Even when he was 95 years old and someone went to his house with a camera and started asking questions, I know that his answers were given in a way that gives the impression of something that he didn't believe in. And all you have to do is look at all his other interviews. He always said, I did not invent anything. What he developed was a unique style, which is very common for any. Robert has his style, right? Roger Gracie has his style. Helio Gracie had a particular style, a defensive style, that enabled him to go against these amazing Japanese black belts and not lose, and tire them out, and in many cases even win.
You guys think it's a case of? I think it's a case of a lot of this history is lost in translation too. Like Robert, coming across in your discoveries, like was a lot of this the translation part of these interviews maybe not translated right? Maybe in Helio's interview where he says I created or I invented jiu-jitsu, or any article or history you come across, could that be a part of the problem in tracking history? Is translation?
Look, I haven't translated my own book. I will say the translation is far more harder than people think it is. I give a due respect for translators, because sometimes I'm not even sure what I mean. So finding out, figuring out what the other person means, and I've got into this a little bit, where like you get a book that has like two different translators, and you go to the same passage and they translate it very different meanings in the second language. So you have to be careful. It's definitely. I'll give you an example. Like I use the word stubborn in the book, right? I call it a stubborn resistance, and in Portuguese it has a slightly different connotation. I didn't realize it until someone brought it up. Teimosia, which is almost insulting. It's not really, and I didn't mean it that way. I didn't mean it as demeaning. I meant it almost as a compliment. Like this is stubborn. I'm not quitting. Whereas in Portuguese, it's almost like a disobedient child kind of connotation. Like it's a little bit different. It's not the same, right? I couldn't find a better term, but I didn't realize it until after. So these things can be complicated. On the particular interview that Pedro was referring to, I think that obviously Helio did not invent anything, right? Like he had everyone has their own style. Everyone is inventing their own jiu-jitsu in that sense. In that sense, every blue belt on the planet is inventing jiu-jitsu. But he creates something new. I'm not sure he actually believed that, but Pedro did say something the other day in another podcast. He said something about, he probably felt like he wasn't appreciated, right? Given his advanced age, and given the fact that he didn't feel appreciated, because he probably saw jiu-jitsu growing way outside of his. Like, the whole thing grew so quickly. He was at the center of it, but so many people were getting recognition, and it wasn't always him, right? And perhaps he felt at an advanced age, it might be that he felt that he deserved a lot more. I felt he got plenty, but maybe in his mind he deserved more. And he voiced it in a way to try to draw some of the attention back on him and going, wait a second, I did this.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's fair. It's what he said. Like, I don't think there's a translation issue there. Like, I translated that interview. I think it's pretty straightforward.
Hmm.
But again, we would have been 93, 94, right? And it's not one of those things where, I mean, if you had we have a prime, a physical prime in our lives. We also have an intellectual prime. I believe that. We also have an emotional prime. It's like anything else. I don't think Helio was at any of his primes in 93. He could be. He could be forgiven. With that being said, I think that Helio definitely wanted more of the credibility. I think he got plenty. I mean, his pictures on the wall in like almost every gym in the world.
Mhm.
But I think he probably felt that he deserved more as he saw the sport grow, and he was not the only person drawing attention. I don't know. Pedro knew him. I never met Helio, right? So I can't speak to him as a person.
Hmm.
Like, as far as the translation goes, like I don't see a problem with translation in that particular.
Yeah, no, the issue, I think that Robert is right with respect of him not feeling appreciated. And I think that sometimes we have the impression that he's really appreciated, but I think that appreciation came much more after he passed than before.
Mhm.
I know for a fact that he felt that he was not being appreciated by people who he taught, who were not giving him credit and things like that, which is natural in jiu-jitsu. But I think that also we need to understand that this particular interview, which obviously we can see it on YouTube, but the guy, he did not know that he was speaking to the world when these guys came to his house. And I think he was probably a little bit annoyed at that moment. I know, watching the interview and seeing the way he speaks, he's trying to be a little bit blunt. In a way, he's talking to those two guys, and he's not expecting that now to become the a point of analysis for historians to find out what happened to jiu-jitsu in Brazil, right? And I think that we have to look at all the interviews and not just that one. I was with him when he was giving interviews to the Japanese press, and he was talking about the history to the Japanese press. I translated many of his interviews, many of them, where he was talking about history. And a common theme was, I did not invent anything. He always repeated those words. And there are plenty of interviews that we can find on YouTube of him saying that I did not invent anything. However, I was small, I was light, and I fought people who were bigger than me. So I had to develop a style to be able to face those guys, a defense to be able to face those guys, especially when it came to strikes. And that, I think that he deserves a lot of credit for. Developing a system of defense against strikes from the guard. I haven't found anything like that in any of the Japanese books. The level of defense and the sophistication of his defensive game against chokes, against arm locks, against leg locks, a game of anticipation, a game of precision, of being able to understand what the opponent is trying to do before he or she does it, and being able to defend. His defense was amazing. Hiron, his grandson, showed a little bit of that game when he fought André Galvão. And he was on bottom side mount, bottom mount, and André Galvão was not able to submit him. But Hélio Gracie was a genius when it came to that. And the second, I'm not going to use the word invention or creation, but something that he developed was a teaching methodology for anyone to be able to learn.
Mhm.
And that was really, really genius. The way that he would teach jiu-jitsu and the sophistication of the pedagogy in his method is really, really amazing. Now, many people don't even know that exists because it's not in a book, it's not in a video. But I know because I learned and I saw him as a teacher and as a psychologist, and he really developed an amazing teaching method, which is quite different than the judo pedagogy and the judo methodology. For example, Jigoro Kano. Are we to believe in, and now I'm going to use the same point about not believing in messianic figures. Are we to believe that Jigoro Kano, that jiu-jitsu before Jigoro Kano right? Koryu Jiu-Jitsu was pure kata and guys doing Aikido-like moves. And then suddenly Jigoro Kano at 22 years old invents all the grappling, all the throwing, all of that. Like that in 2 years, his guys are beating all the other Jiu-Jitsu schools. Come on. Even if Jigoro Kano was Einstein, that would not be possible. We understand fighting. We understand how long these things take to develop. Jigoro Kano was basically doing the same thing that was being done, the jiu-jitsu that was being practiced during his time. Now, he did create an amazing teaching methodology, and that's according to him. A methodology, a pedagogy. And most importantly, he added the philosophy, which he thought was paramount. Oh, but he changed the name from judo to jiu-jitsu. Yes, because jiu-jitsu had developed a bad name. Because of the pro fights that were going on, that Jigoro Kano referred to them as a prostitution of the style, Jigoro Kano's words, he felt that it was important to create a new name. And even schools of jiu-jitsu that were not under Jigoro Kano started using the judo name because the judo name was more respected. So it was a name change in Japan. But did Jigoro Kano really create a completely new style that we can say, no, the Gracies did not do jiu-jitsu, they did judo? I disagree with that. Yes, they did judo because Maeda was a student of the Kodokan. But yes, judo is jiu-jitsu. Judo is jiu-jitsu. So we're talking about the same thing. Now, Helio Gracie invented BJJ. No, he invented the rules of the sport. He was the president of the federation. So the sport, yes, was created by him. So maybe that's what he was talking about. He invented the sport, BJJ, obviously with other people involved. Francisco Mansur played a very, very important role in that movement of creating BJJ, creating the sport. But Helio Gracie was the head of that movement. So in a way, he's the one that created the sport, but not the art. Helio Gracie didn't create the art. Jigoro Kano didn't create the art. It's a collective process that takes place through many, many years.
And I think the biggest thing is, we're all here, we're all in the present, and our goal is to lift the whole sport, to lift the whole sport as a group.
Yeah.
Guys, and this is a point where, me and Pedro, we've discussed this at length in private. Like obviously there's a lot of agreements. We do have some disagreements, right? Like I agree with him when he says that no one really creates anything. I'm always suspicious of why I invented this, right? Like you dig this deep and you find out that someone is already doing it before you. Now, for example, you can always say that someone who does a lapel guard does it in a more sophisticated manner than someone did 10 years ago, or same thing for a heel hook, right? But to say that you invented it, I'm always suspicious of that because from my experience, and I think most people would agree with me. I think everyone would agree with me. It's the trial and error that's really perfected. Like that really smart guy in the room. Because for the grappling intelligence that I admire has very little to do with traditional intelligence as we understand it. I've met people in jiu-jitsu that barely knew how to read. I'm not making this up. People that were borderline illiterate, not even semi-illiterate. And they were absolute geniuses when it came to jiu-jitsu. Very specific kind of intelligence. But that didn't mean that they were coming up with stuff like all the time. It was mostly like on the spot, trial and error. They were very creative. Right? It was still combat that created that perfection. It was the trial and error, which is one reason why I put like the development of jiu-jitsu, the ground game in Brazil. It was fairly slow. It accelerates tremendously in the 90s. But what happened in the 90s? Competition. There was a tournament. It's like so you have evolution, but it's a very slow pace. And when you add the number of practitioners grow, the number of schools grow, the number of tournaments grow, you accelerate that evolution, because look at today, like how quickly it's evolving, because we've never had so many competitions and so many practitioners. Add to that the internet and the spread of information, which would have been very slow then. And Matt, as Pedro Valente mentions a triangle in 1935 in a newspaper article executed by Yasuichi Ono. And then Carlos Gracie Jr. is saying that he didn't learn to try for the late 70s. So we're talking 35-year gap here, 40-year gap for a move from Sao Paulo to Rio de Janeiro.
Right.
And back to Sao Paulo in the 90s, like 20 years later. So just imagine how slowly information was traveling then compared to now.
Yeah, now you're just typing it in, YouTube or wherever, and you're finding a wealth of knowledge.
That's when a purple belt is bragging about how much he knows because he's literally done it. I'm like, literally patting yourself on the back for doing nothing. But hey, to each their own, right?
Yeah.
But I think Helio is, to me, he's a fascinating character. As far as technical, I think anyone who trains jiu-jitsu is developing new things. I think that Helio's big role here is not a technical one. I'm sure he had details that I would learn from. I no shame in saying this, and I'm sure that anyone who's been training for a long time would have things that they would be able to add to the equation. If we sit down 50 black belts and we all showed an armbar from closed guard, they'll all be slightly different, and I would learn 49 other ways of doing something slightly different. And none of them are wrong. Some of them are more efficient than others, but they're all valid, right? So people do have their own adaptations, and that's clear to me. But I think that Helio, like the reason why he is ought to be remembered is really has to do with the resistance. I think that the resistance he posed to judo, right? And when I say stubborn, I use it almost as a compliment. I don't mean it in the Portuguese version of the word.
Robert, sorry to interrupt, but he actually considered himself to be stubborn, so you know.
Yeah, and I mean it I think it was necessary. So imagine someone who wasn't stubborn in his shoes. Jiu-Jitsu has survived. It's impossible to have futurism of the past, right? That discipline, thankfully, it doesn't exist, right?
Well,
what would have happened, and that's not fair on anyone. I have a hard time imagining, right, without that stubborn resistance. I think it was necessary.
Well, I think all of us have to be a little stubborn to do jiu-jitsu just to begin with.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
I think really the whole, I want to just commend you, Robert, because I think looking back into history, with an objective, scientific method manner that you're doing it, can really have all the, the students in jiu-jitsu now, everybody who's training jiu-jitsu to be able to see the history and really see how it came about. Also learn about, how important the Gracies were really, because even though we all know the Gracies and the general story, your book, believe it or not, even shines light on that even more, when you're looking at it objectively in the way that you are. And you look at my history in 1999, the movie Choke came out, and that movie was just so inspirational when you watched Choke, and then you're like, wow, jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu is all about just what works in a real situation. You know what I mean? What works out there in a real fight. And so that draws everybody in. And now you see it grow to a point where there's all these different factions. And then we have, people that are preserving the roots, trying to get back to the self-defense. You're seeing the leg lock game. You're seeing the rule sets. But I think the more that we look back into the history, which is what you're doing now with this book and the documentary, and the Valente Brothers on their YouTube channel, and really the more I think we see where this all came from and came about, like to your point with Maeda, like we all have multiple teachers, but the biggest teacher is your mats and your fights, and Maeda's fights along his career got to the point where that method of fighting made its way to Brazil. So I really think this is a huge thing, and I really think this is an important thing for us to be doing. What's your goal for the documentary and the book, and just for people looking back into history? What do you want them to do from it?
Do you mind me saying something before we get into the goals of the documentary, real quick, with respect to the rules? I agree with most of what Robert said. I do believe that the biggest contribution of the Gracie brothers, Carlos and Helio, was the preservation of a brand of jiu-jitsu that was going to die, in my opinion, if it wasn't for them. They were not the only ones practicing it initially, but if it wasn't for them specifically, it would probably just morph into judo, into Olympic judo, and we wouldn't have it today. So I do agree that that's their main contribution. But I also think that if in the 1950s, Helio Gracie, together with Carlson, João Alberto Barreto, Hélio Vigio, Robson Gracie, those main guys there had said, let's get together and record a secret video showing our most advanced techniques, I think a lot of people today would be surprised. Unfortunately, we don't have that. But I think that their technique was good. Imagine, we know for a fact that Ono, in 1936, when he fought Hélio Gracie, he knew the triangle. Hélio Gracie didn't. Isn't it amazing that Ono wasn't able to submit him with the triangle?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yukio Kato, Many people say, well, Cato was not the second best. He wasn't. He was in Portuguese vice-campeão mundial. He wasn't the second best, but he was a fifth degree. And he was traveling with Kimura. Kimura would not bring someone of no prestige. So the guy was a fifth degree traveling with Kimura, and Hélio Gracie was able to choke him.
You're unconscious, right?
Right? Yes.
Yeah.
So the fact is that Hélio Gracie's technique for the time and for the circumstances where jiu-jitsu not being the cradle of Brazil, not being the cradle of jiu-jitsu, the limited access that they had, no YouTube, no internet videos, nothing like that. I think it's quite amazing. And I do think that his technique is something that should be studied and considered, because I believe that in being his student, more than that, I think that, as Robert said, it's not the main thing, but I think it's something that is incredible, at least to me. With respect to the rules, Robert speaks about the quick evolution that happened in the 90s. I believe that competition is the main reason, as he mentions, but I also think there's another aspect that we must consider. Until the 80s, and that's when I started training in the 70s and 80s, anytime a jiu-jitsu technique was taught, even though they were doing pure grappling matches all the time, the sparring was without strikes, but students would raise their hand when a technique was taught by the instructor and say, what if the guy throws a punch? And that question was always taken seriously. So jiu-jitsu was never detached from fighting. So it would be difficult to teach some of the techniques that are taught today, because immediately that question would be asked. So you're doing a lapel guard and somebody says, okay, what about the guy on top throwing a punch? You say, okay, then I can't do that. So that limits the evolution a lot. The moment that jiu-jitsu, the tournaments became prevalent, then the objective was no longer jiu-jitsu as a fighting art, but it was winning the tournaments and becoming the best at that specific game. Then they did not have to worry about striking anymore. And that opened the way for a huge evolution for the development and creation of moves that would have never been possible before, because they would not want to do something that would expose you to punches and to strikes. Right? So that's another caveat in this evolution that took place in the 90s that I think should be considered as well.
Can I just make a comment to that? Because this to me this is way more interesting than my Carlos thing, by the way. I think this is infinitely more interesting discussion. That's a very good point. I never thought about that. There is, however, yes, like if you say, oh, if I punch you, you shouldn't be able to use that. And if you use that criteria, it is true that a lot of modern jiu-jitsu goes out the window, which I am ambivalent about, because A, I do think there's a room for berimbolo and lapel guarded jiu-jitsu. B, I've always preferred the martial style. I prefer a jiu-jitsu that works everywhere. It's always what I practice. It's always what I teach. I teach a jiu-jitsu. I prefer the half guard because it works everywhere, for example. With that being said, there's a lot of things that we're practicing that aren't very martial. Like I mentioned, like, for example, a collar choke from guy. A lot of that, like, would not work in a real fight. If you apply that criteria everywhere, if I am able to punch you, then this should not be practiced. A lot of what was practiced will be eliminated. With that being said, I see the point. I think it's a valid point. But if you're going to make something truly martial, you're going to end up with MMA. If you're going to have like a basic, it's going to be virtually indistinguishable from what we see in the UFC today. And that's, even though what the Gracie's style in many ways came close to that. Like if you look at Royce Gracie, like, no, he would not win today, but what he was doing was not so different from, like, there was striking into takedown, into submission. Like that was there. I think they were on the right track about a lot of things, but much of what would practice would not work in a real fight.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast.
I know.
And I agree with Robert that this is far more interesting. And we can talk about how the deep grip in the lapel is about controlling the head, and how that makes it difficult to strike, and how back in the time most people would wear jackets to go out in the street, and that would make more sense than on a T-shirt that we wear today. But that's a very long conversation.
Yeah, we would
Pedro,
love
saving that. We're definitely saving that for the next one with the two of you.
I think there's a lot. There's a lot. Like the other questions that we have go into all of that stuff, which is cool. We can make it a part two. You know, I think there's so many other things that we can talk about.
But yeah, Robert, why don't you tell us where we find more about your book, where we find more about your documentary that's coming out, and then Pedro, same thing for you.
Well, documentary. So like, I do have some. It's working. I don't want to give you it, guys, because I've done that in the past and I regret doing it. But it's, again, the priority is always going to be the quality over the speed of production, right? And the bigger this gets, the more people know about it, the more responsibility we feel, right? As far as the book, it is available. You can go to closedguardfilm.com. We have it there in English, Portuguese, and Polish. We are working on a Spanish and German translation. They're taking longer than expected, but we are in the works. But closedguardfilm.com is where you can buy the film.
And Pedro, where can everyone learn more about you?
Yes, Valente Brothers. We are on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel. Once or twice a week, we are now releasing technique videos on the stand-up self-defense, which people are very interested in. So we are doing that currently. We're on Facebook. We are on Twitter. We are all over social media. And most importantly, whenever you are in Miami, make sure you come to our school. Robert has been with us. I was honored to be interviewed for his documentary. I'm looking forward to it coming out soon. And all of you who are watching us, we have an open door policy. You're all welcome. We have a little museum. We have the library. I'm speaking from the library here right now, and we're always very happy to share what we have on the history. So all of you are very much invited to come to our school. And thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Robert, for being part of the show. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
No, I appreciate you guys coming on. It's a real honor and a privilege to have both of you guys on. And like I said, I think a huge part of what all of jiu-jitsu practitioners around the world could do is really look into the history. There's way more to the story than what you know. And, both of these guys here we have on the show are a big part of that, trying to look back into history and learn how it all became. And I think we could only have more honor and respect for the art that we practice, and then to see where it's going to go from here. But obviously we touched on a lot of topics that we could continue on. So we'd love to have you guys on for a part two of this, especially maybe, post documentary release. We have a lot more that we can go into with, talking about rule sets, talking about practicality, jiu-jitsu techniques, where the sport is going. And for everybody listening, we'll be continuing to have guests on the show. We're going to have the ability to review your roll. Please keep sending us your videos of you rolling. We'll be able to feature that on the podcast. We're going to be having, we got at least another 10 guys scheduled for the next few months. And keep an eye on jiu-jitsumotivation.com. We have the Instagram. We're going to be posting unique video content. People are going to be sending our technique videos. They're going to be available right on the website, podcast, and a lot more coming soon. We're really honored to have our first official episode with you guys. And can't wait to see more about different findings on Closed Guard and the documentary.
Yeah, make sure you check out Robert's book. Make sure you check out the Valente Brothers website and their new tutorials that are coming out, guys. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.